texting messages. Hello and welcome everyone for joining us for our second Ready Set live stream. The theme for this event is Ready Set Optimized for Cloud, and we'll be discussing the challenges and opportunities for cloud migration, management, and monitoring. My name is Greg Neerman, and I'll be hosting this event for the next hour with a spectacular set of presenters and panelists. Let's start off with some context though. We all know that cloud migrations don't all look alike, and there's pain when they go badly. Optimizing for cloud is often correlated to cost optimization, but it goes much deeper than that. It's also about people, process, and data. Understanding and taking inventory of data assets that support your applications might sound like a simple, logical first step, but it's often the biggest hurdle, and without the right tools, often difficult. And this in turn impacts people, the process, and ultimately your users. To go deeper on this, I'd like to introduce our presenters, starting with our keynote presenter, Mark Thiele. Mark and I have discussed and debated this topic for what feels like a decade. Mark's broad industry experience and wisdom comes from a career that has spanned operating roles to driving cloud adoption across enterprises of all sizes. Today, Mark is the founder and CEO of a new startup, Edgevana. Mark's going to help us level set about the real challenges in the market for cloud migration. I'm also joined by Phoebe Go, principal architect at NetApp, and Josh Moore, principal technologist, also from NetApp, who will help us understand user expectations for management and monitoring of your environments. We'll also have what I'm certain is going to be a very lively panel discussion with representatives across the industry, who I'd like to introduce now. Ben DeQual, principal Azure customer engineer at Microsoft. Nadine Cummings, technical solutions manager at Arrow Electronics. And finally, Eric Becker, solution architect at Worldwide Technologies. And if you are watching this on LinkedIn or YouTube, we encourage you to add your questions and comments in the live stream directly or on Twitter using the hashtag NetApp. And we'll do our best to get to those questions live or with our teams in those channels. And with the introductions out of the way, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mark Thiele. Mark, I've joked that we should simply take all of our applications, all of our data, hit the easy button, and move it to the cloud. But in all seriousness, the strategies and considerations are a bit more nuanced than that. But I don't want to speak for you. I'll let you take it away.
Greg, thanks. And hello, everyone. Appreciate the warm welcome, Greg. And you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, in these times, some folks have felt pressured to make the easy button choice. And in others, they're just not thinking through all of the ramifications of poor decisions relative to how they distribute their data or where they maintain and how they maintain their data. So, why is today different? Well, certainly we could talk about the acceleration of digitization efforts and how those efforts are affected or even further accelerated by current goings on associated with things like the pandemic as a perfect example. Also, how does that affect your staffing models? A lot of folks have been surprised during this period when they realized that they had one or two people that were great at doing their storage environment, and both of those people were unavailable and there was nobody else to take over for them. What about customer and employee needs and how they're changing? The model today is work from home, and what I like to actually say is WFA, or work from anywhere. Why is that different, and how much does that affect your storage strategy and your ability to provide the kind of access and support that your customers, both employee customers and external customers, need? So, macro drivers are really transformation, to me, edge computing, which is a potential extension of business transformation, among other things, and response to the pandemic. So adapting, to this changing landscape, what are some of the traditional things that we might worry about? I mean, I know that when I was running IT infrastructure, the first thing on my list and the first thing today and the first thing on my list then was, how do I provide the customer with an application experience that satisfies their demand, meets SLAs, et cetera, and latency in all its forms, from distance to performance latency between CPU and IO retrieval, et cetera, or what they like to call, click to IO and back. All of those things have latency, and latency is a key driver. And so, to Greg's point earlier about the complexity of making those choices, latency is potentially hugely impacted if you make poor choices around where your data resides, depending on where your applications reside and what type of applications require that data. Cost, of course, is always a consideration, and As we all know, poorly run storage in the cloud or outside the cloud can have cost ramifications, among other things. But within the cloud, public cloud as an example, as much as I'm an adherent and a strong believer in public cloud, storage is something you have to consider very carefully, as that's likely going to be your biggest charge area over time. Compliance, obviously we need to think about that and as a potential driver for either maintaining storage on site or certainly having better oversight from a provider. Security, staffing, and control. So all of those things are important. When I think about staffing specifically, I want to pick on that item. Going back to the point I made a minute ago, is that your staffing has a number of ramifications in the situation that we're in today. And in one case, it's, do I have training overlap in order to provide support, even if some of my key personnel are out and unavailable due to a situation like the pandemic? But in other cases, kind of an extension of that is, are you using tools that allow you to quickly grant access and permissions to someone else on the broader team who might be able to accommodate at least simple activities to help facilitate continued operations? So having uniform tools, having a well-managed storage environment with those uniform tools that are simple to manage offers you additional flexibility beyond just saying, I'm going to make sure that the two people I have doing my storage environment never get sick, right? And so, new considerations include widely distributed customer or employee base, especially with the work from anywhere thing, a latency to the nth degree, especially as you start thinking about edge and distributing for more of your internal and external customers, and agility in the age of cloud-based storage. I mean, agility is literally everything today. So new considerations, humans. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about humans anymore, other than the fact that if you don't take them into account, then you're failed before you get started. Geo distribution. Most companies that I talk to today are thinking in the form of, how do I apply my strategies from a global standpoint, from where my customers are, both internal and external, and where I can operate most effectively. Geosensitivity, what many people call data sovereignty issues. Again, agility. What's your exit strategy? How can you possibly have agility if you've put your storage somewhere that takes weeks or millions of dollars to extricate? That's not what I would consider agile. Lean and efficient staffing and simplification of platforms, as I mentioned earlier. So in the end, this is really about the customer. And the customer, I think we've learned more so now than ever before. The customer is key to success, but the customer is not just that person that might be buying your product on the street. The customer is your employee. And if the employee can effectively do their work, if their applications are performant and they feel good about how they're working and they can be productive, that's a positive for you. It's a positive for you. It's a positive for the external customer. And it becomes positive for what used to be considered first, which is your quote unquote stakeholder, the people that own your company's stock. It really needs to start with the internal employee, and giving them great performance on their applications is a great way to do that. So takeaways: being prepared, not reactive. Think about how your environment would work if you removed half the people, and not just an equal half, but maybe half in two specific jobs and leaving a giant hole in the middle. Adapting to the changing landscape. Business transformation, in my mind, will lead to significant change in how and where we create data, how quickly we need to be able to respond to it, how well we can react to the data that we receive and know what to do with it, among other things, and then customer expectation. And yes, the employee, they are still job one. So with that, Greg, I'd like to pass it back to you, and thank you very much.
Mark, I gotta just tell you, I am so disappointed that there's not an easy button for us to hit to make these migrations just happen. And with that in mind, I want to introduce Phoebe and Josh. And Phoebe, you and I have talked about this on the Go Your Way podcast, and about the user experience, the user journey as they start these migrations. What are some of the reflections that you have from talking to users in the industry?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it always starts with the customer, Greg. And in my conversations with people around the world, talking about cloud, it's about the challenges of moving things, but also thinking about, what we do with what we currently have. It's not an instant on cloud migration. It's a process. It's a journey. And one of the most common threads I'm actually hearing is really, do we transform those applications? Do we start using some of that cloud PaaS and SaaS offerings, or do we lift and shift because we need to get it into the cloud because we need to create more business value? What's the most cost-effective way to move? What's the most optimal way to move? And so that's why I'm really glad today to be joined by Josh Moore, because in working in the cloud analytics product group at NetApp, I know you've been having these conversations too, Josh. In your experience, what are some of those key elements that people are keeping in mind or should keep in mind while they're going through that kind of transformation and migration?
Yeah, so I mean, when we talk about, do we transform now and then migrate to the cloud, or do we lift and shift and then worry about it at a later date? I don't think there's a right answer there, right? It's down to whoever owns the application, whoever builds the application to make those decisions. But ultimately, you have to look back at the reason you're moving, because there should be a reason you're moving to the cloud. If there's not, maybe consider why you're doing it. That could be time between releases. It could be, front-end response time for like faraway geos or something like that. Maybe it's just improving some golden signals for performance. Whatever it is, I think what's most important is not how you get there. It's first making a baseline of what you have today, what these key metrics are, what these key deliverables are as part of that migration, and then the ability to track those consistently during the period of change, in the before, during, and after. So if you're chopping and changing your tool sets as part of that migration, that can be difficult because you could be comparing apples to oranges. Getting this right is important for success, right? Because you don't want to be one of those companies that you hear about that went all in on the cloud because reasons, and then actually ended up retreating because it was either too expensive or they found they weren't missing their service levels.
Oh, you talked about that key thing about cost, right? And I think when we think about optimization, cost is that one that's always front of mind, either during the migration process of moving applications or moving data, or then of running the operational day-to-day of running those applications in the cloud. How do you suggest we keep the reins on things like service levels and performance metrics? How do we optimize that environment, so that the end user is getting the experience that they need?
So you mentioned cost, and it's okay to be scared about cost because we have, lots of stories about organizations that have gone all in and it's absolutely costed them a fortune. So, I mean, these are the ones you hear about retreating from the cloud. IT used to be the gatekeeper, right? There was change control that was around provision of resources, and that was the control of cost ultimately. So agility to some with what the clouds bring, is the ability to provision what you need, when you need, to the level you need it. To others, that sounds like anarchy, right? Just everyone provisioning what they want. Sounds like the use of a bottomless pit of resources, yet you don't have a bottomless budget. So lots of people talk about cost reports, and they're important, right? I see those more as a case of budgeting than optimization. Optimization is the result of that budgeting. So I have a pie chart with dollars and cents on it, and I need to start spending less, or maybe I need to just do more with what I've got today without spending any more. The thing is, a pie chart with a dollar value isn't all that actionable. It's not to say it's not important, but ultimately we rely on people digging into why that number is too big to then do something about that. So one approach that I see very effective for a lot of people is that of integrating optimization metrics into the morning coffee workflow. So every engineer, every admin out there has their view of the world that they come into the office or, log on in the morning and they see, is my application healthy? Is it doing what I expect it to do performance-wise? Is there anything that happened overnight that I have to check out? Well, if organizations can then integrate optimization metrics into that. So for instance, is there a legacy project resources that haven't been decommissioned? Have I gone off and provisioned fast storage when I don't actually need that much speed? Have I got too many VMs for my workload? That's more actionable, and that can actually lead to proactive cost optimization instead of getting a scare at the end of the month with the bill and going back to see what we can do about it.
Yeah, and definitely, I imagine as we move into more hybrid or cloud or even multi-cloud environments, that morning coffee break, either we have a lot of coffee or we have a great dashboard that shows it and actions and on all the things that we can do. But on the top of people's minds as well is that person behind the coffee or in front of the dashboard. How do we enable those people to be, I guess, optimal resources or optimal workforce we have cloud engineers and DevOps engineers, we have people learning lots of new technologies. What do you think are the best ways that organizations can help their people to be successful through these transitions?
Yeah, so the concept of people optimization sounds a little bit scary. I know if I heard my management talking about it, I might get a bit worried. We shouldn't and can't even be thinking about just let's get rid of the infrastructure people and hire a bunch of people with cloud certs, reference to what Mark mentioned earlier. And this goes back to that consistent view of the world I was mentioning before. So if we have a consistent pane through which we can view our environment as it is today, as it will be throughout this extended period of transition, because, as Greg said, there's no easy button to do this, and it's going to take some time, and then continue to use those same tool sets in the future when we have reached our, future mode of operation. This is a great way to ease those people into it. So we can go to those admins and engineers that have been looking after, storage arrays in our own data centers or looking after databases and servers in our data centers for years and start to upskill them into a tool set that lets them grow instead of saying, you know what, we're throwing out all the legacy tools. You've got to learn all this new stuff. And consistent management is part of that, consistent enablement of people, I think.
That's awesome. I do know that the best way to learn is by doing something. And when Mark was talking about work from anywhere, it kind of struck me how important it is that platforms are available anywhere. So what kind of approach would you recommend to, our audience or people who are looking to go about optimizing their environments in cloud, on premises, and their infrastructure?
So I'm biased, I'm in the cloud analytics group. The jewel in our crown is something called Cloud Insights. So this is a tool that gives you, full stack visibility, whether you're on-prem or whether you're in the cloud, or like a lot of organizations, a bit of both and a lot of change. And once you're up and running, there's so much information at your fingertips, whether you're a DBA or a storage admin or an operations manager. So, if you're into monitoring, troubleshooting, integration, or optimization, as we're talking about today, it's covered there. I don't expect anyone to take my word for it. We are offering a 60-day trial where you can go and kick the tires for yourself. So the question that arises is, well, what can I do during the duration of the trial? And 60 days is a long time, right? What can't you do when you've got, all of this data right there, easily accessible? I think what's more interesting is, what about the first few days? What about the first afternoon? So, for even very large environments with dozens and dozens of data centers, you can actually start to collect that information very quickly, and it's in a very straightforward manner. There's no big servers to deploy. There's no complex collectors to deploy. So we started talking about this baseline of your current environment. And in the course of, an afternoon or just a couple of days, whether you've got a few storage arrays or, as I say, multiple data centers, you'll be able to build that baseline very, very quickly. So then you can plan for the future and where you go from there.
Oh, I love that. It's about getting started, right? That's the first step in this journey. And I do know there is a link in this webcast, so do click on that and have a look at some of the tool that Josh was talking about. But definitely getting that baseline sounds like a really great start. Thank you so much for joining me today, Josh. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm really excited to see what our audience does with that. So back to you, Greg.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Phoebe and Josh. And I just want to note for everybody right down below, be sure to check the link out, 60-day free trial there. That's my commercial for this. So please jump in, try. And literally, when I was talking to Josh about this and dipping my toes in the water with Cloud Insights myself, Josh wasn't kidding. The question isn't what can you do with it, it's what you can't do with it. So take a good look at that. Also, we're going to be opening up this panel discussion here. Be sure to add your questions in the comments in the streams, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube or on Twitter. But let's kick off our panel discussion. And I'm going to pick on Ben first because, Ben, you work at Microsoft Azure and you get exposure to a lot of the challenges in the environments from a wide variety of customers. What are some of the big ones that pop out to you?
Yeah, we see customers wanting to try and do everything at once and move a whole DC. Don't try and do this. Look at application by application, pick it for a reason, and do that first. That's sort of one of the big things we always say. So start with things you can address. The fundamentals are a big thing that let people down. They're so quick to want to move everything to the cloud. They'll just pick it up and dump things in, and then trying to go back afterwards and think about how do I set up my security, my networking, identity, just-in-time access, monitoring. It's kind of hard after the events happen. Get that done before you start moving things that are production. Don't do it the same way. So people start with VMs predominantly. That's normal, but they get caught out by over provisioning because on premises, this doesn't have a penalty. You've got that CapEx on there. In the cloud, it comes with a hefty bill. And start, designing these applications then as well for agility, as Mark said at the beginning, because that's the value of the cloud is flexibility. And work then to define these SLAs properly and re-architect to meet the SLAs when you agree with them on a business. People don't understand that the VM giving me 99.95% SLA on this in an availability set means that my application is going to get 99.95. I have to do composite SLAs properly and explain that to their business.
Fantastic. And Nadine, you have a broad view of this across the industry with the challenges and the opportunities. But I'm curious, how are you defining your customer and your users' success?
That's a really good question, Greg. In terms of success, I really think that definition varies across different spectrums, because at Arrow, we're pretty much like the heart of the IT sales channel. So we work with vendors and suppliers. We work with end users. We also work with a lot of VARs, which is pretty much our pinnacle of being successful. And if you talk to these different entities, their definition of success is different. So from a VAR and a supplier perspective, we want to help them have better or greater account penetration. Also, customer retention, right? How can we help them pursue new markets, identify some new markets or even adjacent technologies? And then at the end of the day, success also looks like increased revenue, right? How do we increase profit margin? But that also varies. Let's talk to the end user. They really want to be able to take their business issues, and we want to help map that to a certain set of technologies and then apply related services on top of that. So success varies, but I think that Arrow does a wonderful job of trying to find that end game for those different entities. So even from a supplier perspective, making sure that their technologies can be marketed properly, giving them the right tool set to integrate different technologies. Like, for instance, we do have an Arrow Intelligent Toolset for VDI, and that's NetApp HCI with NVIDIA, and then we incorporate some workspace solutions. But that helps customers with their business use cases, and we also help them with the technical lift by providing those technology solutions on top of that. So goal of success varies, but within our channel, we're able to maneuver and provide that for everyone.
That's fantastic. You're right. The definition, the bar for success is going to be different for each of those elements in the chain, and ultimately what's driving user success. Eric, as you work with customers, Phoebe and Josh were talking about kind of the user experience, but I'm curious from your perspective, what's some of the preparation that you're going through as you're planning these migrations with users?
Yeah, great question. And, obviously it depends on the organization, but a lot of times, the organization may have already started to migrate into the cloud, or they may be planning on doing so. They may have gone in without a plan and are, hitting some pain points now. And, so typically what we'll do is we'll just figure out where they are right now. Let's start with an assessment of infrastructure, applications, services, and then also the people. What are their skill sets today, and what are they covering in terms of what applications and services they're monitoring. And then, as we get more data around their infrastructure, we, like mentioned before, we can't just rely on existing sizing or anything like that. We need more analytics and insights into, what's the actual utilization, what are the performance requirements, because we can't just take one-to-one lift and shift into the cloud. A lot of times that may be due to cost, or they may be migrating to a platform, so there's not the same type of metrics or one-to-one correlation. And then, from there, we just kind of, we have an iterative approach on continually moving those applications. So, as mentioned before, instead of looking at just individual VMs, migrate an application or a specific service, out to the cloud, and then, take a step back, reevaluate, look at, what you've migrated, and then, take the next service or application. And then, obviously, to do that, you really need kind of a heterogeneous view of all your applications, services, and your infrastructure, so your entire environment. And then once you have that, you can always look back historically and say, how am I monitoring my progress? Where was I? Where am I going to be tomorrow? And then, adjust as needed. And what do you guys see, Josh, in terms of, as organizations are moving to the cloud and moving to, not just lift and shift, but platform services, how has that changed their needs for visibility of their applications and services, their new metrics that they're looking at, and who are the stakeholders? Is it still the same end user that's looking at these analytics platforms?
So, I think information it's everywhere today, right? And I think, the rise of the smartphone means we've got so much information about everything we do in our personal lives at our fingertips. Why should it be difficult to get these, metrics and speeds and feeds, whether they are, end user facing or, customer success metrics, or whether they're, just latency on storage and virtual machines and things like that? Why does it have to be difficult to get those, and why can't everybody access it? Well, we've come from a world where, there's probably a lot of storage tools that the storage team use, and only the storage team uses that. And then we have a database team somewhere that uses a bunch of database tools, but they're the only ones that use that. So one of the things, that we're certainly trying to do with Cloud Insights, and that we find, is just beneficial overall to IT teams, is to democratize information. So it's not about just making it available to everyone. It's about making it available to everyone in a way that everyone can consume. So when we have an application stack, there's probably a dozen different components involved in actually getting a service to a customer. So it's no good having a dozen different element managers to, shout their speeds and feeds, especially when something goes wrong, fingers get pointed all over the place, and it's very difficult to fix anything. So, we try to visualize those in a way that is not only beneficial to the experts for whatever component they're responsible for, but actually everybody. So, your question is, who's using this information? Well, I think if you do it right, it should be everybody being able to use all of the information about the entire stack, right through from, customer experience and right down to the various, low-level latency and saturation metrics at the bottom of the stack.
Yeah, great points.
I had a question for you, Mark. Because you're on the supplier side, but you also talk to end users, what do you see end users moving away from? Where do you see the bulk of customers moving away from?
Yeah, I think, I know this may sound too generic, Nadine. It's a great question, but with many answers. But if I had to pick just one answer, I would say they're moving away from all or nothing. Right. I think that, and I would love to do a panel just on the topic that I'm about to mention, and that's best fit IT. Right. I think we've come a long way in the technologies we provide to our customers, and I was one of those customers for 25 years. And my career is littered with pragmatic choices, and pragmatic should be, spelled differently. It's not meant to be a positive word in this case, like negotiating between two people and coming to a happy ending. Pragmatic in IT meant you made a devil's choice because you had no option because of cost or complexity or something else, right? And I see the market today as being, a fantastic option of using cloud. I mean, I love Microsoft's cloud as a example, not to pander to our friend from Microsoft, but
we'll take it, man. Thanks, Mark.
All right. I mean, but I've also used GCP. I've used Amazon. I've even done a little bit of stuff on Ollie Cloud. All of them have their potential benefits. Right. But what's really interesting today is that the flexibility that's available to the consumer of IT means that we can address customer opportunities specific to that need, not to use a CPU kind of problem like we used to with x86, whereas, we have a problem that we need compute for. Well, how many more x86 CPUs do we have to put in front of it to brute force it? Today, we can program to FPGAs and ARM and GPUs and et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing should be true in almost every type of deployment we do. But, and now I'm pandering a little bit maybe to NetApp. I was a longtime user of NetApp. I built my first SAN on NetApp when I was at Gilead back in 2001 to 2005.
I honestly didn't know that. That's great news.
And that was back when NetApp hardly could spell the word SAN, and we built one anyway. But I loved the simplicity of the tools. Even back then, in my environment, I treated the growth of what we were doing in similar ways, without it being documented, to what you would expect from the SREs at Google, where their mantra is, and I'm not positive I'm 100% accurate, but it's something similar to the effect of 50% more each year, right? So while they may be doing 100% more work next year, they only hire another 25% to 50% more people, as opposed to having to have a linear line of support of people to the linear growth of technology that you're acquiring. And my use of NetApp meant that I had to argue with my most experienced storage person who thought tweaking the dials was the most important aspect of his or her job, and instead overruled him so that I could have 4 of my administrative folks in the data center work on the storage environment without it being so specialized that he was out sick. I was, proverbially screwed, as they say.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the challenge of understanding what we have in our environment as we're preparing for these cloud migrations, it's funny because I'll point this out to Josh, but I'll just reflect with Mark real quick, is that we probably have more years in the industry than we care to admit. But the challenge of understanding what you have in your environment or across your network and other locations is a challenge that the industry's been wrestling with for a while. And it goes back to just simple backup days, taking an inventory of your data assets and understanding what the priorities were and what the recovery times were and all of that. And Josh, as we look at this in this era, which is not a new era, I'm making it sound like it's new, but we've been doing this for nearly a decade now. When we think about these cloud migrations and this is simplicity, the simplistic step of taking that on-premise inventory of those data assets and kind of creating a value and a plan around those data assets. On one hand, it's surprising to me that we're still wrestling with this issue, and we could probably pat ourselves on the back that the right tools haven't been out there to be able to do that assessment. As customers are understanding, or users are trying to understand the value of those assets, it's one thing to see it on a dashboard. How do you take that from dashboard to action as you're leveraging these tools?
So yeah, I think that one of the first issues we've had to kind of get our heads around as an industry, that those silos are dead, right? I mean, I grew up in the storage and backup space, and if someone started talking to me about databases and other types of workloads, be like, nope, not my problem. That's for someone else. So I think the first part is, instead of looking at our workload from a case of this is the storage, this is the compute, this is the application, this is the web layer, and so on and so forth, we need to start looking at it as this is a workload. Right, all of you different people that are responsible for all the different cogs and sprockets in this workload, you're all in this together, because ultimately the reason it exists is to do something for someone, whether that's an e-commerce store for a customer or something else. If that customer doesn't click and something gets added to the basket, that's irrelevant. So once we do that, I think it's a lot easier to work together as a virtual team to plan, how do we do this? Well, is this a case of lifting and shifting to get it to the cloud if our first objective is to reduce latencies for geographically dispersed customers? Or maybe the application owner decides it's more important to increase customer capacity, and we've got all the brain power within that virtual team to be able to find a good way to do that in a way that, if you look at it from a point of view of well, let's reduce our, we don't want to go and pay our storage vendor for more storage in our data centers this year. Let's go put it in the cloud. And I think that's the way we need to approach it instead of look at it from that component point of view.
So when do you go into the cave and start creating the easy button for all of us?
It's coming.
You're working
future.
And Ben, I think it's very interesting, right? Because you've got a unique view on this, and not only helping organizations plan these migrations, doing that kind of identification. Microsoft's in a very unique position here. And again, I don't want to, bend over backwards, patting on the back too hard, but you guys are in a unique position because many of the customers you're working with, they're already working with Microsoft on premises, right? And so taking that inventory and understanding those assets, I'm going to imagine you almost have a leg up to do that.
Well, there's certain things that we can do pretty well in taking that inventory, and of course, but there's things we're not. Still, predominantly, we are living in an IaaS world for what people migrate. So we have to actually start looking at people that used to be enemies of Microsoft and now our friends. VMware, for example, we now have VMware in Azure. We'll do things like you can run Horizon Cloud in Azure. It's a really, really interesting world. I think we picked up Partner of the Year with VMware. Crazy world if you look back 5 years. So that to me is sort of one of those interesting things that we see what customers are doing and how it works. We have that visibility on premises, but that's quite often limited to that Microsoft stack. And as we see more and more, people move things to the cloud and they'll go and pick up that VM and move it, but then they'll start to re-architect, use infra as code, and they might do then other things and start abstracting higher and higher. And we're seeing more and more open source too. The rise in containers is seeing a lot more Linux as people move workloads to the cloud. So us and every cloud provider out there is in a space where Linux is the predominant OS that's being deployed. So it does help.
Getting used to Microsoft and Linux in the same sentence.
I think I put it on the back of my t-shirt if you want that. But yeah, no, it's a crazy, it's really interesting. Like some of the background we have with customers actually inhibits us from moving forward at times, and we have to work really hard to break out of those shackles because of that very reason that things we said were bad 10, 15 years ago, we are now advocating for and working with customers and contributing to projects for.
A little bit now, aren't you?
So it's almost like we're having to go and work twice as hard as anyone else to prove that, hey, we are open, we do support this, and this works. It's a really, really interesting world. And what I said before about like people not just doing things the way they did it on premises, you can't just go and use a workload in cloud and assume that you have a single VM with HA working like it does on premises. It doesn't happen that way. You have to change this architecture, reevaluate. It's a good time. Look, I think what we're seeing, and it was mentioned, we have no specialists so much anymore. You still need to have people who are SMEs in an area, but you're getting the stage now where you have to take up more and more, and you go from being an IaaS operator to going and understanding more about infra as code and DevOps. DevOps doesn't mean you're a developer; it's a process, and there is no easy button. Sorry, Josh. There will not be an easy button anytime I can see soon. I mean, I've seen people write, thousands of lines of Terraform or other code and templating in JSON. And this is not going to do away with the human element of how do we plan for this? What do we need to do? And those kind of discussions are the biggest complexity. Once we get that worked out, the actual deployment becomes the easier part.
Really, that does become the easier part. Mark, I was teasing you online that you were going to hurt my brain today. So let me kind of throw a curveball at you. We've talked quite frequently for years in different conversations about migration, but from the perspective of lift and shift or refactoring applications. And I think part of the consideration is you're looking at an inventory of your assets and the applications you're currently running. That's part of the question. It's part of the dynamics that we have to think about when we're looking at this. Do you get a strong sense that, and I kind of have a sense between the application types, what's getting refactored and what's getting shifted over. Do you have is there any rule of thumb about where that decision is to not do the lift and shift, but to refactor applications?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many variables, right, to this. I mean, I look at this problem from a leadership standpoint and from an ability to manage what I'm asking for and lead through it and benefit from the change afterwards. And so when I look at, if I'm looking at a pile, as my friend Ralph Laura would call the average IT organization, looks a lot like the Winchester Mystery House from the way it's built. Right. When I think about making a decision about whether to grandfather something out as I move to the cloud, whether I plan to take something largely as is and put it in the cloud or take something and refactor it, a lot of choices have to go into that decision, like what kind of staff do I have? What kind of training and team do I have to support what gets moved to the cloud? How much comfort do I have that the application in question, designed by somebody else 5 years ago, is actually suitable for the cloud in the first place, and what's the best way to test for that? The vast majority of organizations, I mean, most of us here, at least many of us here, come to some degree from the white tower, the ivory tower environments of places like Silicon Valley, right? And so when we think of these problems, we think, oh, I don't know what you mean. We'll just throw some coders at the problem and we'll fix it. Well, I've been helping a lot of CIOs just as advice, not as a vendor, as advice when I was a CIO and after that. And I can tell you that there's probably 70% of organizations in the world that don't know what a coder is in their organization. They've got some script kiddies in infrastructure, and they've got programmers that work on their SAP or Oracle or whatever else they have in their data center. None of that is going to be refactored. None of it is going to be refactored. They're not going to build a new app. Their motivation and their opportunity to do something different is when NetSuite does it different, or when Oracle does it different, or when SAP does it different. So then they have to look at all the other little apps. Well, I can tell you that one of the problems that those of us on the vendor side, I have to say that now, it's awkward, but I have to say that, those of us on the vendor side get into the bad habit of using the all or nothing story, right? And all or nothing has never been true, except maybe in the days of IBM mainframe, in the 70s and 80s, and Ben, not picking on you, but Microsoft between 85 and 2005. That was kind of the only times where it was almost true. But that everything approach today doesn't work for so many different reasons, and not the least of which is the fact that we just aren't designed from an organizational structure standpoint to support making a bunch of apps that are well trended and well understood in our environment just cloud native, because cloud native is the right answer long term. So yeah, because the truth is that if it's a well-trended app today and it doesn't go beyond 20% above normal run rate on any given day or hour of the year or month, then the actual benefit of moving to the cloud is negligible as compared to the effort of making it happen and making it work effectively. Now, that is not a statement to say that moving to the cloud is a bad idea, but like anything, even as Ben was saying, there isn't an easy button, and you need to take this from a value equation standpoint. So when I'm thinking about moving things to the cloud or not moving things to the cloud, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, well, could I be spending more effort on building that application that will give me leverage at the edge? Should I be spending more effort on those applications that will actually facilitate? I mean, you guys this is a storage story that we're on right now. And one of the problems that I've faced, I feel like I'm digressing a tiny bit here, but it's related. One of the stories I've faced throughout my entire career is when I wasn't a CIO, and even when I was a CIO, somebody always yelling in my ear, I need real-time data, real-time data. I was at a conference in London speaking to about 1,000 people, and I asked the room, I said, how many of you work in IT? And typical conference, about 30% of them raised their hands. I said, how many of you have been asked, and I'm not talking about data center monitoring for failure, I'm talking about data that the business would use to make changes or whatever. How many of you have been asked for real-time data? Almost every single hand went up. I said, how many of you think the business uses your data in anything approaching real time? One hand went up.
That's very typical.
That is our gap, right? That right there is our gap. That spells lack of agility. That spells lack of organizational design. That means we do not have a DevOps way of thinking throughout the organization. That means we are not business transformed. And there's just so much opportunity for all of us there.
No, it absolutely is, Mark. And I could tell that the hand motions, you're very passionate about it. The scars are still fresh, apparently. So, well, I'd like to take this opportunity. The folks that are watching on YouTube and LinkedIn, please feel free to ask questions or ask those questions in Twitter. But I want to open it up to the questions that other folks of our panel might have. Nadine, any questions that you might have for our presenters?
Yes, in terms of cloud insights, I'm hearing wonderful things on my end, Joshua, about cloud insights. Can you share with us any NDA roadmap stuff?
On
a public forum, I'm sure you can, Josh.
Yeah, this is where he gets hit by lightning.
It's no fairer than this, right? We're all here.
Yeah, this is a closed audience, right? No, I mean, I think what I can share is that, you know, I've talked a lot today about making more information more available to more people and more accessible to more people. So, you know, I think one thing we can look forward to is more of that, to be honest, to get, you know, information easier to consume by people that, you know, wouldn't necessarily be consuming it. So, you know, maybe that is something like the ability to, you know, combine and derive things just in a way that you can't do today.
Yeah, well, and by the way, mad props to the Millennium Falcon. I think that is behind your shoulder there.
It is. That is.
Is that a Lego set?
That is 27 hours of blood, sweat, and tears. I think if I remember. I think the most fun was putting it together, but I'm certainly not taking it apart now.
Which is easier, a cloud migration for a medium-sized business or putting together that Millennium Falcon?
Well, I think the key difference is that you have instructions for that.
Kudos.
And it can be done by one person, right?
Yeah.
I love like a lot of the conversations I've been having, and I want to ask Eric a question, which is that, you know, during these processes, these migrations, and we're talking about people a lot, like how soon is it that we think about enabling the people to use the tools, or do we look for simpler tools that more people can use? When you're kind of out designing those solutions, what is your approach to the people side of the optimization and migration element?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really, I hate to say it again, but, you know, it always depends. You know, I think on a lot of these situations where we're doing these migrations, we kind of instill in them that they need to think about infrastructure differently. They need to think about their applications differently. You know, in terms of scale, you know, they're not going to, if they're trying to, you know, refactor these applications to be, you know, cloud native, they're going to scale massively and they can't manage them the same way that they used to. The funny thing is, I think on the tail end, they kind of forget that they can't monitor them the same way they used to either. You know, you're not going to set up the static dashboard that you had for, you know, your one big application. Typically, you know, you're going to have to scale, you know, the infrastructure is kind of grow dynamically, or you're going to have a lot of, you know, DevOps engineers constantly iterating over that infrastructure and redeploying the application. So you need to think about, as you're changing your deployment methods and how you're consuming the infrastructure, also how you're monitoring it. So, you know, using, you know, tags and automation and rules to kind of build out that visibility. So it's not just every time you deploy something new, you have to create a new dashboard with the same static metrics.
That's fantastic. You know, Josh, I have another question for you. We talked about, and again, this is going to sound like a commercial, but I mean, look, I'm personally very passionate about cloud insights. Josh, I know you are. You're as intimate as anybody is with it. And I think about a lot of the benefits that come out of using a tool like that. If somebody was going to use the 60-day trial, we talked about some of the things that they could do kind of near term. If I was going to make the case for the business value of using that, how would you sum up the business value for Cloud Insights?
I think one of the first questions I ask a lot of customers in discussions I have with them about Cloud Insights is, how many tools are you using today to manage your environment? And, you know, the thing is, I could be with an audience of 10 different people within an organization, between the 10 of them, they don't know. You ask each individual, how many tools are you using? 6. And the next person says 12. The next person says 1. I think, one of the key value points early on is that, guess what? You can get a lot of what you can, you're having to go to all these different element managers for today from the one place. And I know the kind of the single pane of glass approach is kind of very cliched and tired. And I don't think that's what anyone wants, is a single pane of glass to do everything. I think what's important is to have that common hymn sheet everyone can sing from. It doesn't mean that you can't use your element managers anymore, because, you might need to use that for provisioning or, the deepest dive metrics there are. But if everyone can use the same tool set and the same normalized metrics across the board, that can improve, operational efficiency a great deal. Like one of the features we have in Cloud Insights is that of metric normalization. So what I mean by that is whether we're looking at a virtual machine in Azure or AWS or GCP or, VMware or OpenStack or whatever, it's just a VM to us. So when we set up our alerting and our policies and our dashboards to visualize VMs, we're not creating them once for Azure, once for Google, once for VMware, and so on and so forth. And that's where we can get a lot of those efficiencies for the people.
Absolutely. And Phoebe, you and I have talked about this on the Go Your Way podcast quite a few times. I love tapping into your wisdom on this, because you're looking at this from many different perspectives. One of them, and Ben, cover your ears for a second. So when we talk about multiple different cloud providers, and we always encourage people to use the right tool for the right job, and that goes for whether it's an application or where the data is. Do you see, this is going to put you in the hot seat here, do you see any distinctions from a cloud migration perspective as it relates to those different cloud providers, or is the process generally the same?
Well, I think if you start at the end, which is what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve, at the end of the day, a cloud provider is a set of tools and a set of services that's going to make that easier for you, or hopefully make that more effective and more efficient for you and more agile, to our points earlier. So I think if you think about what you're trying to achieve, the way that you go about it should be pretty similar, but obviously you need to take into consideration all of the differences between and nuances between how you're using that technology. And I think that's why, for me, the key thing is always about the people and understanding how people operate in those environments, what things that they need to do to be successful. Sometimes there are tools to help you be more successful, but it always starts with, okay, what are you trying to achieve? Do I have the right process? And then how do I enable my people to be successful in that environment? Whether it's AWS, whether it's Azure, whether it's Alibaba, and often, sometimes when it's in a private cloud or an on-premises or a hybrid environment, and there's all those different things, but you've got to keep focus on what is the outcome you want and what are the people going to have to do to get to that outcome.
That's fantastic. We're in the home stretch here. So what I'd like to do is kind of go around the horn for any last words. Mark, we'll let you wrap up. And I'm going to pick on Eric first. Eric, any last words and considerations our audience should think about when it comes to cloud migrations?
No, I mean, I think we touched on a lot of the aspects today. I think, one of the things that I thought Mark brought up that was really interesting was, the lack of real-time data. And, it's kind of interesting. I think in a lot of cases, that's not only just not having the data, but sometimes there's too much data that's not normalized. You can't correlate at all. You have many disparate dashboards and everything else. So just one of the things, we kind of think about is, the simplicity behind how they're doing their migrations and how they're monitoring and kind of reassessing those migrations as they move forward.
Fantastic. Nadine, I'm going to pick on you next.
Yeah, thank you. Before I do leave, it would behoove me not to mention some of those challenges and how the whole movement to or migration to cloud can be cumbersome, whether it's trying to integrate multiple technologies or even from a partner perspective. How do they bill, or how do they understand what the stack looks like, and how do they have predictive cost and gain from it? So it behooved me to not mention that Arrow's Fair has the ability to do that. And we also have the ability to maintain the capacity and resiliency and manage that cost for migrating to the cloud. We also have Microsoft partnerships, as well as NetApp, Ben, Josh, and Phoebe. So take that into consideration when migrating to the cloud or thinking of a way that you can wrap your company services around cloud and helping your customers migrate.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for joining us today, Nadine. Phoebe, it's your turn. Any parting shots here?
I would say, I think the thing that I love the most about the cloud is that it is all completely accessible now to everybody. And so, what I liked about when I was talking to Josh is that anybody can go and give this a go. Anybody can go and sign up and try these things and understand not just does it work and do the tools and the features and the widgets look the way that I want them to, but how can I integrate these into other workflows? Maybe not this project, maybe it's the next project. And it becomes a lot easier to try before you buy it. And the same with Azure and the same with AWS and Google. They make it so possible. And I love that because it democratizes the whole experience.
Yes, fantastic. Yes. Thank you, Phoebe. Josh, before we stick you back in the cave, any last words?
In the cave?
To go build something else.
I think what's been clear talking to everybody here is that it's about people at the end of the day. It's not about paying someone else your bills for storage or something like that. So just to Phoebe's point, if you do want to try a trial of Cloud Insights, that's great, but don't keep it to yourself, right? You hear of too many organizations that say, well, we're moving to the cloud because the boss says we should do that because to pay the bills and things like that. Use it as an opportunity to say, well, how can I do this? How can I, really lean into it? And how can I use tooling to, help this migration into the environment? And how can I, work with my colleagues better in this new world?
Fantastic, and thank you. I pushed your buttons a little bit here, Josh, today, but it's fantastic having you on. Really great insight. And
My
Ben,
pleasure.
we've done quite a few things together, podcasts and other things over the years. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today. What are your parting thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the big things we have to look at now the people I've mentioned already, there is no easy button with people, but don't get frozen by saying I have to modernize this app before I move it. People don't do that. If you get stuck trying to modernize and rebuild something before you move it to cloud, you're missing that whole window. And also, how are you going to get the turnaround space to do that on premises? Take what you have and run it in a way that makes sense for you, a realistic abstraction level. Mark was talking about this prior as well. You run that highest level of abstraction that's reasonable, not what looks cool on paper. Have something you can manage and then we'll run the application. Some applications aren't going to modernize. Things like, SAP. We do a lot of SAP in cloud. People aren't going and making massive architectural changes. It's on VMs with a lot of memory. The value there is what can I run around that? What's the ecosystem? What I can do about that and the flexibility. So yeah, don't get frozen. Take what you have, optimize it as you move it, and then look to modernize beyond that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time today. And Mark, bring us home here. What are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me on. I had a blast, and I learned a lot from the rest of the panelists today. So Greg, really appreciate it. This may be boring. I tend to lean on the people aspect of the story more than some people would like. Those of us in tech want to talk new shiny all the time. But keep in mind that as much as the tools we have available, cloud tools, platform tools, the storage tools we've been talking about here are all fantastic. It starts with the organization and principle and procedure and strategy within the organization as a whole first, right? So if we don't solve for organization, if we don't solve for principles, if we don't apply something like DevOps to how we do our work, even if we're still using hammers and nails in IT, if we apply DevOps strategy to it, we can give a better result to our customer being internal or external. And that's what we have to target first. From that, we get success, we define what we need, and then we get tools to help make us more successful so that we can continue to scale that. But making ourselves faster, spending money, as much as I love doing that, just like anybody else does, spending money on making ourselves faster does us no good if we do it without the business.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a great note to wrap it up on. At the end of the day, Mark, It's always about the people and the culture first. And a lot of times we let the technology get ahead of us when we think in terms of what we can do. So thank you so much, Mark. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. I want to do a very special thank you to Tim, Andrew, Bart, and Bruce, the team behind this. A lot of work went in. This looks simple as you're viewing it, but a lot of work went in from that team to make this successful. So thank you. Thank you to our audience. And again, check out the links below. Also, if you're watching this on demand, please add questions. We'll be monitoring this for a while and happy to engage with you. And on that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for joining us today.